On a late summer afternoon in 1994, deep in the Allegheny forest of Pennsylvania, a ranger named Owen Teller heard a scream unlike anything he'd known. Rushing to the old iron bridge, he saw a small creature swept away by the flood, half human, covered in fur, amber eyes wide with fear. Without hesitation, Owen jumped in. He pulled it ashore, and that's when he saw it. A massive silhouette in the fog, a Bigfoot, silent, watching, not to attack, not to reclaim, just waiting. This is not a monster story. It's a story about compassion between those who once feared each other. What happened next? How a grieving widow, a skeptical ranger, and a terrified child formed a bond stronger than blood. We'll challenge what you believe about humanity, kindness, and the debts we carry in silence. Because sometimes the scariest thing in the forest isn't the beast. It's forgetting how to be kind. By the end of this story, you'll know why a Bigfoot bowed before a human, what was returned on a rainy morning in silence, and how a single whispered promise saved lives. But before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? How far can this story travel? This quiet tale of courage, trust, and redemption. Wherever you are, from our little corner of the forest, we send you our warmest hello. The end of summer had left the air thick with heat, and the river swollen from weeks of storms upriver. Clarion River cut like a copper ribbon through the woods that glowed with the last orange threads of sunset, its surface breathing steam into the darkening sky. Crickets sang in high numbers from every shadow, and the occasional bullfrog lowed like a tired church bell. The old iron bridge moaned under its own weight each time the wind stirred. Owen Teller leaned against the wooden post by the south end of the bridge, notebook in hand, binoculars tucked beneath one arm. He wasn't supposed to be out this late, but the herd of white-tailed deer had moved through later than usual, and something in him hated leaving a record unfinished. He wrote down the count, then stood still for a moment, letting the sound of the river press against him like a hand. Somewhere upstream, a woodpecker tapped once, twice, then fell quiet. A cloud of gnats shifted in the humidity around the brim of his hat. That's when the scream came. Sharp, not high-pitched, but broken like something tearing. It wasn't an animal sound, not exactly human either. He froze, not because he didn't know where it came from. He did, almost immediately. It came from the river. Owen dropped the notebook and ran, boots slapping wet gravel. A second cry came, shorter and lower, like it was being swallowed. He reached the edge where the embankment dropped off and scanned the water. For a second, all he saw was churning brown flood and floating branches. And then he spotted it. A shape, small, but not animal small. Human small, clinging to a thick branch, spinning slow circles near the center of the river. Dark brown fur plastered to its body, arms flailing, then gripping again. A face turned toward him, wild, trembling. And the eyes, not the eyes of a raccoon or a lost child. Amber, bright, holding on to something more than just the log. He hesitated. Rules shouted in the back of his mind. Radio first. Assess the danger. Don't go in unless you're trained. But something older than rules tightened in his chest like a fist. Something that said, no matter what it was drowning. And drowning things scream the same. He threw the rope from the bridge post, once, twice. Missed. Without thinking further, he hooked the line around his waist and jumped. The current hit like freight. Cold, strong, full of branches and bark. He fought sideways, boots slipping off the rocks, keeping his eyes on the branch and the small form locked onto it. He reached it just as it slipped under again. He grabbed hold. A tiny arm clamped around his neck, soaked fur, fragile frame, lungs against his collarbone, wheezing. He kicked hard and let the river spin them backward toward the bank. The rope went taut, He clawed at roots and moss, dragging them up with everything he had. Mud gave way under his knees. The child, no, not a child, coughed once, twice, water spurting from its mouth, then went still. He rolled it over on its side and stared. The creature had the shape of a child, but longer arms, wider shoulders. Brown fur coated its frame, thin in places, soaked to the skin. Its hands had 5 fingers. Its toes were thick and curled like they'd been meant for tree bark. But it was the face that held him. Human-like, but not human. Wild man. The nose was flat, the brow heavy. Fur covered the cheeks lightly, but the skin beneath was visible, damp, gray-brown, young. A short beard traced the chin, not quite fully grown in. But the eyes, those eyes were wide with something ancient, something fearful. They blinked once, twice, and didn't look away. Owen's breath broke in pieces. The sun had dipped low behind the ridge, and the air around them felt heavy with water and shadow. Then something shifted. From across the river, a silence fell. No birds, no insects, just the sound of water, and then a shape. He turned slowly. Between the trees on the far bank, shrouded by fog that lifted from the water like smoke, a figure stood watching. Huge, at least 9 feet tall, shoulders like carved stone, fur dark and damp, a hand thick and human-like, resting on the trunk of a maple tree. The face, God. It looked like a man pulled from another time, wild, tired, watching, the same amber eyes. He didn't move. Owen didn't breathe. The small creature by his side stirred, and Owen instinctively placed a hand on its back. The larger figure on the far bank didn't growl, didn't charge. He just stood, eyes locked with Owen's, as if reading every second of what had just happened. Owen swallowed. "Come get your kid," he whispered under his breath, though he knew no sound could cross that water. But the figure didn't move forward. Instead, it took a step back, then another. Fog swallowed its legs, then its chest. It paused, one hand still resting against the trunk, and with a final look that held no rage, no fear, only resignation. It turned and stepped into the trees. Gone. Owen sat back, mud seeping into the seat of his pants. The creature beside him, this child, this something, curled slightly, as if the warmth of the earth was better than the cold river. He looked at its hand, still gripping the moss. Long fingers. Strong. He knew he should call it in. He knew the moment he touched that radio, everything would change. But the thing was shivering now, not from cold alone. From fear, from exhaustion, from being alone. A distant owl called through the dark trees. The last of the sunset burned out behind the hills, leaving only the sky's memory of orange. The rope lay slack beside them, half buried in mud. The log had long since floated away. Owen reached down and gently lifted the creature. It was lighter than he thought, but dense, like muscle packed tight with bone. It didn't resist, just trembled. He walked back toward the truck, boots squelching in wet ground, the night growing thicker with every step. Crickets started again behind him, slowly. The world picked up its sounds where it had left off. When he reached the cab, he opened the door with one hand and looked back once. The river was dark now, just a moving mirror of stars. But he could still feel the presence across the water, long gone but not forgotten. He placed the creature gently in the passenger seat, wrapped it in his spare jacket. Its head lolled, eyes half open. He turned the key, and the old engine rattled to life. As the truck rolled forward down the gravel path, the wind came off the river, cool and heavy. It swept in through the open window, and with it came a sound. Not quite a whisper, not quite a breeze. A promise. The river had given something up, and now it belonged to him, whether he wanted it or not. The oil lamp on the porch gave off a low amber glow. flickering against the moth-bitten screen door like a tired heartbeat. Heat from the day still lingered between the wooden slats of the floorboards, clinging to the dust and the scent of crushed mint. A cicada wheezed somewhere in the distance, already slowing into the rhythm of night. Ruth Ann McCrae stood barefoot at the threshold, her hand still wrapped around the brass knob, as if she'd known he was coming before his truck had even rattled up the gravel road. And she had. "Put it down by the fire," she said, without looking at him. Voice soft but firm, like the way she used to give bad news in the ER, low and warm, never asking for permission. Owen didn't speak. He moved past her into the house, the screen door creaking closed behind him, and walked straight toward the stone fireplace at the end of the living room. The creature in his arms shifted slightly beneath the heavy flannel blanket he'd wrapped it in. Not a cry, not a growl, just a breath. Shallow, unsure. Like it didn't know whether it was still allowed to be alive. The living room smelled like linen and iodine, like old quilts and something baking faintly in the kitchen that had long since cooled. On the mantel, framed photographs sat close together. One of a young woman in a nurse's uniform, another of a baby wrapped in a hospital blanket, a folded flag in a triangular case, and one more, dustless, still warm from being recently held. Ruth Ann's daughter, gone long ago. The fire hadn't been lit in days, but the bricks still held the memory of heat. Owen knelt, carefully set the creature down on the braided rug, and drew the blanket back. The face turned toward the light, still wet, still scared. Amber eyes opened only halfway. Ruth Ann joined him without a word, easing down to her knees with the quiet strength of someone who had done this kind of thing more times than she could count. She brought a basin and a faded towel, her movements practiced, slow, respectful. She dipped the cloth into warm water and squeezed it once over the creature's shoulder. Steam rose. Owen didn't realize how tightly he'd been holding his breath until he saw her hands move. Not shaking, not hesitant, just steady. The way she'd bathed the dying. The way she'd washed her daughter's face after the fever took her. "It's not a child," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I know what it's not," Ruth Ann said, voice flat. Then she looked at him. "But it's hurt and it's breathing. That's all that matters tonight." He nodded. He felt smaller than he had on the riverbank. She dabbed gently along the creature's arm, revealing a long, shallow scrape lined with grit. The creature winced, but didn't pull away. It watched her, not with confusion, but with something else. Caution. Memory. Like it had seen a hand like hers before, and remembered how it felt. She worked in silence. Owen sat on the floor beside her, his knees bent up, his hands clasped loosely. He hadn't noticed how wet he still was, how the cold had started to settle in behind his ribs. The room was warm, but not enough to stop the shivering that came not just from his skin, but from somewhere inside him. A different kind of ache. On the wall above the couch, the photo of Ruth Ann's daughter stared down. Brown hair, bright smile, blue graduation robe. Owen looked away. "I should have called someone," he said finally. "Then why didn't you?" she asked, not looking up. "Because—" He stopped. The firelight flickered against the floor. He shook his head. "I don't know. Yes, you do." And he did. It just didn't have words. He hadn't had words that day either. Years ago, different river, different scream, same guilt. A car upside down in the water, a window he couldn't break fast enough, a hand he couldn't reach. Sometimes silence doesn't keep secrets. Sometimes it just holds you down by the shoulders and makes you relive the worst parts. He glanced back at the creature. Its chest rose and fell slow now, eyes heavy but still open. There was something familiar in the way it curled its legs in, something heartbreakingly human in the way it watched their faces. "You think it'll make it?" he asked. Ruth Ann pressed the cloth to another wound, then wrapped gauze around the arm with firm, careful hands. "I think it already has. The rest is just living." Outside, the wind picked up through the trees, pushing dry leaves across the porch. A low creak sounded on the front step. Not loud, but deliberate. Owen stiffened. Ruth Ann's eyes flicked to the window, then back down. She didn't move. "Something's out there," he said. She nodded. "Let it be." They both sat still for a long moment. Then the sound came again. A slow exhale against the glass, heavy and humid, fogging the window pane just above the rocking chair. Ruth Ann didn't look. Not this time. She leaned forward, pulled the quilt tighter around the creature, and stood. "If it wanted in," she said quietly, "we'd know." Owen followed her to the kitchen. She pulled 2 mugs down from the cupboard, poured weak tea from a kettle that had been keeping warm on the wood stove. She handed him a cup and stood with her back to the sink, watching the front of the house. "You think it's the father?" he asked. She nodded again. "Or the guardian. Maybe both." Owen looked down at the tea, the way the leaves clung to the bottom. "He just stood there, didn't try to stop me." Maybe he knew he couldn't. The wind moved again, brushing against the house in long, slow breaths. Like something was walking in slow circles, staying just out of sight, but never far. The floor creaked above them. They both looked up, then silence. No footsteps, no sound at all, except the slow ticking of the clock on the wall and the soft breath of the fire. Owen opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't want to break whatever spell had settled over the house. By morning, the world looked different. Pale blue light spilled across the front porch, catching in the condensation on the windows. The woods beyond the yard looked quieter than usual, as if they too were holding their breath. Ty Carver showed up like he always did. Barefoot, backpack slung one shoulder, face smudged with dirt and mosquito bites. He never knocked. Ruth Ann had told him long ago that the door was always open for neighbors, and Ty had taken her seriously. He stepped up onto the porch, ready to ask for cinnamon toast or tell her about a turtle he saw near the road. Then he froze. Right there, in the dew, just outside the porch steps. A footprint. Too wide, too long. 5 toes, no shoe tread, just the clean imprint of something upright and heavy. Another print just beside it, and another, half faded. A trail that stopped near the woodpile and disappeared into the brush. Ty crouched down, touched the edge of the print. It was still wet, still fresh. The hair on his arm stood up. Not fear, exactly. Just the kind of stillness that tells you you're not alone. He didn't say anything about it when he went inside. But later, he sat on the back step with his notebook and started to draw what he'd seen. A tall shape, broad shoulders, long arms. A face both strange and familiar, and eyes like someone watching from just past the edge of the firelight. That night, Ruth Ann woke with a start. The house was quiet, save for the soft ticking from the kitchen and the distant hum of crickets. She sat up, rubbed her eyes, and padded barefoot to the hallway. She didn't know why she got up, only that something had called her. She moved toward the living room, the soft hush of the floorboards familiar under her feet. The creature still slept on the rug, curled in the same blanket, breath steady. Then she turned to the window. On the glass, in the pale moonlight, a handprint. Too large for Owen, too wide for Ty. The edges smeared with breath, as if it had leaned close. Close enough to see, close enough to listen. She didn't reach out, didn't wipe it away. Just stood there, one hand on the sill, and looked out into the dark where the trees held their silence. Somewhere past the yard, a twig snapped, and then nothing. No words passed between them, but the message was clear. This child was not abandoned, only entrusted. She stood there until the moonlight shifted, and the handprint faded into mist. Then she turned away, quiet as the wind. And in the silence that followed, something deeper settled in her chest, something heavier than fear, and older than memory. Not every orphan is alone. Not every goodbye means gone. And not every guardian speaks with a voice. By the time September settled into the valley, Clarion County had turned into a slow-breathing quilt of mist and rust-colored leaves. Mornings came quiet and cold. the kind of cold that softened your voice without asking. The first school bells had rung. Hay rides had started. Someone down on Crooked Log Road had already hung scarecrows too early, and every evening now smelled faintly of cider, chimney smoke, and wet moss. Ruth Ann's porch creaked more with the changing air. And inside that old farmhouse, a different kind of season was shifting too. The creature was healing. The wounds had closed over with a thick, uneven scab, dark against the fur. The fever had broken 3 nights back. It moved now, carefully but no longer with fear, only caution. Still didn't speak, didn't growl, but it watched. It watched everything. Owen spent every spare moment with it. Even when he wasn't there, his presence lingered in the way the flannel blanket got tucked just so, the way the pot of broth stayed warm on the back of the stove. He'd bring notebooks and sit cross-legged on the living room floor, sketching, jotting down observations, trying to decode the silent language between them. Sometimes the creature would mimic emotion. If Owen tilted his head, it tilted back. If he blinked slowly, the creature blinked slower. A communion made of quiet things. It never wandered far. Mostly stayed near the hearth or on the braided rug by the old cabinet radio. But one morning, Owen found it crouched in the backyard, carefully arranging smooth river stones into curved lines. Not circles, not spirals. The pattern was off-kilter, half organic, like waves pulled sideways. The stones all pointed in one direction, toward the tree line behind the house. The way home, Owen guessed. Or maybe just a memory of it. The creature stood when it heard him approach, but didn't scatter. It just looked up, blinked once, and turned its face toward the trees again. Owen crouched beside the rocks. "You remember where you came from?" The creature didn't answer, of course, but its fingers, long and calloused, brushed over the final stone in the row. Then it looked at him. Not pleading, not questioning, just waiting to see what he'd do with the silence. Back in the house, Ty Carver had taken to sneaking peeks through the windows. He never came in when the creature was up, never made a sound. But the smudges on the window pane grew more frequent, and the notebook he carried had started to fill with drawings that were no longer about turtles or comic book monsters. One sketch stood out. He'd pressed too hard with the pencil, tearing slightly into the page. It was a face, broad, with thick fur around the cheeks and jaw, heavy brow ridge, a flat nose, but eyes that held something neither animal nor cartoon. It looked like something ancient, but kind, and that was the part that made Ty's fingers hover over the page longer than he meant to. "Did you see it?" his mom had asked him one night over dinner. He'd shaken his head. But he had. That night in the mist. The night after Owen brought it back. Ty had looked out from his back porch and seen the tall shadow move behind Ruth Ann's garden. The shape had paused, almost as if it had turned and seen him too. No growl, no threat. Just the weight of a gaze too big for a boy's lungs to hold. Ruth Ann didn't speak about it. Not to Ty, not even to Owen. But she felt the shift too. There were new prints in the yard every morning now. Not just one. Big ones, medium ones. One set with a bent outer toe, another with a shorter stride. Once, she found a single pine cone placed carefully on the porch rail, still sticky with sap, its scales bent open like a hand waiting to be filled. She swept it into a mason jar and left it on the shelf. Some things weren't questions, just pieces of a conversation you weren't supposed to interrupt. One afternoon, Owen sat in the yard with the creature as the wind picked up from the north. Leaves danced across the gravel. The creature's fur had thickened with the early cold, and the way it sat, knees tucked, spine curved, reminded Owen of the old man who used to fish near Wilson's Bridge. Always quiet, always alert. "You know," Owen said, voice soft, "Ruth Ann says the forest doesn't forget. It just waits." The creature didn't look at him. Its eyes were fixed on the branches swaying overhead. "I'm not sure if I'm helping you or keeping you too long." The creature shifted then, placing one hand on the earth beside the rocks it had laid earlier. Its fingers spread, pressing into the dirt. That night the first crack came, a report from a hunter. Something tall moving near the fish pond. A two-legged animal with arms too long and no visible fur from a distance. Deputy Horton heard it at the bar. The hunter told everyone he'd seen some kind of man-bear out by the edge of the water, dragging its leg. Owen sat stiff at the diner when the news rolled through town like a storm cloud. He pushed his sandwich aside and muttered something about heat stroke and shadows. Horton didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. That evening, Owen stayed late at Ruth Ann's, oiling the front door hinges and checking the windows. The creature watched from the corner, chest rising slow, like it could feel something stirring beyond the walls. "People are going to start asking," he said to Ruth Ann in the kitchen. She wiped her hands on a towel and poured hot water over tea leaves. "Let them." Owen leaned on the sink, looking out the window toward the darkening pines. "They'll want proof. They'll come with dogs." Ruth Ann placed the teapot down harder than she meant to. "Let them try." When he left that night, the clouds had started to roll in heavy over the hills. A storm, maybe. Or just the kind of weather that made silence feel louder. He pulled into his gravel driveway and noticed right away. The porch light was swinging. He got out of the truck slowly, one hand drifting to the radio clipped to his belt. The front door stood ajar. Just a crack. Enough for the wind to whisper through. He stepped inside. The house smelled wrong, like wet bark and river stone. Cold air slid along the floorboards, curling around his boots. "Hello." No answer. The living room window was open, curtain fluttering like a slow breath. On the sill, a single dark hair, long, coarse, twisted in the latch. The blankets were in a heap. The flannel one he'd used that first night. The corner dragged across the floor toward the door. And outside, somewhere deep in the dark, a low sound, not quite a growl, but not human either. Like something remembering how to make a voice. Owen stepped out onto the porch, scanned the woods, the ridge, the empty curve of the driveway. Nothing. Just wind and trees and the sense that something had passed through and left part of itself behind. Back inside, he knelt near the window and stared at the hair in the latch. His hand brushed the wood where the creature must have climbed out. Then, slowly, from behind the ridge, a sound. Deep, distant, almost like thunder. But not thunder. A low call. Too long for an echo, too sad to be threat. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning he found the stones gone. All but one. A single smooth river rock placed on his doorstep. Facing the trees. Facing the way home. And he understood. The creature wasn't running away. It was going toward something. But not alone. Not unguarded. Somewhere out there, the ones who never spoke were beginning to gather. And the forest had started to listen. Clarion County wore its October like a borrowed coat. Sunlit on the outside, but with a hidden chill waiting beneath every breeze. The trees along Route 58 had turned to fire, reds and yellows that trembled like old lanterns in the wind. Cornstalks lined the fence posts. You could hear the slow moan of the grain trucks on the ridge and the laughter of kids tossing hay from the back of flatbeds. It was the kind of weekend that turned the whole town out, even the ones who usually kept to themselves. Owen Teller parked his truck by the edge of the county fairgrounds just after noon. He hadn't planned to stop. But when you're wearing a ranger's uniform in a town this size, not showing up drew more eyes than showing up late. Besides, Ruth Ann had insisted. "Buy yourself a pie," she told him. "And don't come back with that face you wear when you're thinking too much." He moved slowly through the crowd, past the scarecrow contest and the pumpkin catapult set up by the high school kids. Someone was grilling sausages near the 4-H tent. He heard his name twice and raised a hand each time but didn't stop. Too many faces. Too many questions still curled up behind his ribs. He didn't expect to see Nadine Archer. But there she was near the honey booth, clipboard under one arm, cup of cider in the other, standing like a woman with her back pressed against a lifetime of consequences. She was dressed in county-issued khaki, same as him. But the way she stood made the uniform look like something she'd been sewn into. Rigid, battle-worn. "Officer Teller," she said without turning, eyes still scanning the crowd. "Nadine," he said. She finally looked at him. There was something tired in her expression that hadn't been there last spring. Not softer, just more human. "Didn't expect to see you at a place with sugar and children," he said. "I came for the apples," she replied. "And the lies." He raised an eyebrow. "About what people say they saw," she said, voice low. "What they didn't, what they won't admit." Owen kept his hands in his pockets. "You hear something specific?" She sipped her cider. "A hunter swears he saw a bear with shoulders. A woman near Red Barn Trail found her goat spooked and a fence bent from the outside, and a gas worker says something followed his truck through 3 bends on Mill Creek Road. All in the last week." Owen nodded slowly, jaw tightening. "You're not surprised," she said, eyes narrowing. "No." She studied him a moment longer, then leaned in close. "Let me say this straight. If you're protecting something or someone, and it's interfering with the balance we're charged to maintain, I'll remove the conflict. Myself." He met her eyes. "You don't know what you're talking about." "But I know you," she said, stepping back. "And I know what it looks like when you're already standing on the wrong side of the line you drew yourself." That night, wind lashed against Ruth Ann's screen door with hands full of leaves. Owen arrived late, shoulders wet, boots caked in fairground dirt. He barely had time to hang up his jacket before the first thump came from outside. Ruth Ann was already on her feet. They didn't speak, just moved together to the porch, easing open the door with the lamp held low between them. And there he was. The figure stood under the edge of the roof line, silent as bark. The same one from the riverbank. Taller than the door frame, broader than memory. His fur gleamed wet with mist and moonlight. His chest rose in steady rhythm, the breath of something alive but carved from another time. His face, still that same human-like wild man face, held no rage, only patience. A kind of sad authority. The creature inside, still healing, still quiet, made a sound, a sort of whimper, then tried to rise. It took 2 steps, then fell forward on one knee, a fresh spot of red blooming through the bandage near its thigh. Owen rushed forward, but the big one didn't move. He watched, unmoving, even as the small one crawled forward with arms trembling, then collapsed on the wooden slats. The father, if that's what he was, did not reach for his child. He didn't roar, he didn't kneel, he only stood, waiting. Owen looked to Ruth Ann. Her hands clenched the sides of her coat, mouth pressed tight. From the woods behind them came a sudden flicker of light, then another. Truck headlights, the metallic clunk of doors, the harsh zip of a gun being loaded. "Get down!" someone shouted from the trees. "It's right there!" Owen turned, heart hammering. A red beam sliced through the fog, catching on the glint of fur. The tall creature didn't run, didn't lift its hands. It stepped forward, one stride, and placed its body between the child and the light. For the first time, Owen saw fear, not in the creature, but in the men holding rifles. Ruth Ann didn't wait. She stepped off the porch, barehanded, and marched into the beam of the headlights. "Travis Bell," she barked. "I know that voice. You still owe me $40 from the pancake drive. And Davy Simmons, I saw your mother on Thursday. She said you're still afraid of raccoons. This one'll eat you alive." The lights shifted, guns lowered. She kept going. "John Harper, your wife just had hip surgery. What the hell would she say if you brought home a story about shooting something you don't understand?" The silence that followed was tight enough to snap. Then boots shuffled backward. One engine turned over, another. The shadows thinned. By the time Owen reached Ruth Ann's side, the last truck was pulling away. The woods were quiet again. The big creature hadn't moved. Then, slowly, it did something no one expected. It dropped to one knee, then the other, and bowed its head. A full kneel, humble, deliberate. A gesture not of submission, but of acknowledgement. Ruth Ann didn't speak. Owen couldn't. The creature reached forward, not to touch, but to place one open palm flat against the porch floor. Then it rose, turned once toward the trees, and walked back into the dark. The wind followed. The small one was still curled on the boards, breathing heavy, blood soaking into the edge of the flannel blanket. Owen lifted it gently, carried it back inside, felt its chest flutter under his hand like a wing too tired to lift. Neither of them said a word as they cleaned the wound again. The night deepened around them, full of questions they no longer needed to ask. And by morning the porch was empty, save for a single flat stone, warm to the touch, and placed exactly where the big one had kneeled. No footprints, no blood, just that stone, and the feeling that something sacred had been exchanged in the night. Something that didn't speak English, or carry a badge, or answer to rules, but understood the meaning of standing still, of offering your back to the light, and choosing for a moment not to disappear. By the first week of November, the sun had stopped pretending to stay. It rose like a tired flame and fell too early behind the tree line, leaving the house wrapped in long shadows by late afternoon. The mornings were colder now, frost climbing the edges of the porch rail, breath turning white in the air, the world speaking more in silence than in birdsong. Even the crickets had given up their songs to the coming snow. Nobody talked about what happened that night under the porch light. Not Ruth Ann, not Owen, not Ty, and certainly not anyone from town, because no one dared to say they'd been there. But something had shifted. You could feel it in the way Owen stepped slower through the woods now, eyes up, hand always brushing the strap of his radio, even when it wasn't on. The way Ruth Ann lingered longer by the door before turning in for the night, her eyes drifting toward the tree line without blinking, not out of fear, out of waiting. And still, no one said a word. But Ruth Ann had begun leaving food out again. Not scraps, not bait, real food. Sliced apples, sweet cornbread wrapped in wax paper, a jar of broth sealed tight and still warm. Every night it vanished. Every morning something small was left in return. A feather, a broken shell, a bit of bark worn smooth like it had been carried in a pocket for too long. Not gifts, not trade, just recognition. Owen noticed the footprints too. There were more now, different sizes. Some heavy, some light. One with a long outer toe that dragged slightly. Another that circled twice before disappearing into the brush. He didn't follow them. He just stood and looked. As if he knew this wasn't a trail to track. It was a message left in the language of ground and rain. The creature, the child, the one they had saved, was stronger now. It moved with more confidence, though it still limped when the wind came through cold. It watched the windows more, stood longer by the door, and sometimes, when the light was low, it would turn its head sharply, like it heard something no one else could. Owen knew what it meant. It was time. He didn't want to say it. Didn't want to name the feeling that had been growing in his chest like smoke with no fire. But it pressed down on him each night he tried to sleep, and each morning he watched the creature turn toward the woods with that faraway stare. It wasn't just homesickness. It was instinct. A pull older than words. Then Nadine called. Her voice came through the static like a match struck too fast. She didn't ask how he was. Didn't mention the porch or the stone or the night everyone had quietly erased. "I can't cover for you anymore," she said. "I've already ignored 3 field reports, 2 anonymous tips, and I heard from a state contact, unofficially. Someone wants eyes on Clarion." Owen said nothing. "You have 1 day," she said. "Either it's back where it came from, or I come and do what you can't." The line went dead. Owen didn't hang up right away. Just sat there in the cab of his truck, fingers still on the receiver, the cold air pushing through the cracked window and into the collar of his jacket. That night, he didn't go home. He drove to Ruth Ann's and knocked only once before stepping inside. She was at the kitchen table, her hands resting on an old rag that smelled faintly of antiseptic and cedar oil. "You don't look like you've slept," she said. "I haven't." He sat across from her. The creature lay curled on the rug near the stove, back rising and falling steady, face hidden in the folds of a worn blanket. "I have to take it back," Owen said. "Tomorrow." Ruth Ann didn't move, didn't nod, just kept her eyes on the rag in her hands. "There's more of them out there now," he said. "I think they're waiting." She looked up slowly. Her eyes were clearer than his. "Maybe it's not about waiting. Maybe they're watching to see if we're worthy to return it." He swallowed hard. "What if I'm not?" She stood, moved to the stove, poured hot water into 2 mugs. The room was quiet except for the sound of the kettle and the wind tapping at the glass. "You remember when your father died?" she asked, handing him the mug. He nodded, though the answer was already behind his eyes. "You told me once you felt like you couldn't breathe, like you'd missed something you were supposed to see, supposed to stop." "I still do." She sat back down. "You can't save the dead, Owen, but you can keep the living from drowning." He looked at the creature. "It doesn't belong to me." "No," she said, "but it chose you anyway." That night he packed slowly. A thick blanket, the old military coat he'd worn in Tennessee, a coil of rope, a field compass he hadn't used since the fires near Chautauqua. The creature watched him quietly, eyes flicking from item to item as he placed them in the rucksack. It didn't move away when he reached for it, didn't flinch when he touched its shoulder. "You ready?" he asked. It blinked once, then turned to look at the window, where frost had begun to edge the corners like lace. By dawn, the house was surrounded. Owen stepped onto the porch and stopped. Dozens of footprints, circling the house, big and small, fresh in the frost. Not pressed hard, not rushed, just there. A ring, not a threat, a welcome. He turned to Ruth Ann, who stood barefoot in the doorway in her robe, holding a mug of coffee. "They want it back," he said. She nodded once. "Then go give it back." He hesitated. "You don't have to come." "I know," she said, "but I'm going anyway." She disappeared inside and returned dressed for the woods. Layered sweater, coat too big, boots she hadn't worn since her husband passed. She handed Owen a bag with a medical kit, old gauze, water, and dried meat. They walked in silence. Ty followed them to the edge of the tree line. Owen turned back. "Stay here with Horton," he said. "Count bridges. Wait until you see me come out the other side." Ty nodded but didn't say goodbye. The forest swallowed the sound of the road fast. All that remained was breath, wind, and the crunch of early frost beneath boots. The creature rode in Owen's arms, wrapped in the blanket, head resting against his shoulder. It didn't stir, didn't cry. They reached the river by late morning. The same old bridge, the same water, swollen now, dark, pulling harder than before. The banks were slick with mud. Owen started down the incline and stopped. He was there, the father, massive, quiet, standing midstream like a boulder. Water roared around his waist. His arms were at his sides, muscles held loose but ready. Owen stepped forward. The current surged past his boots. The river pulled harder with each step. When he slipped, he felt the cold stab through him, up his spine. He began to fall, but the hand came fast, massive, warm, fingers like branches around his forearm. The creature pulled him upright. Not hard, not rough, just enough. They locked eyes again. Owen felt it again. That same thing from the porch. Not a warning, not a command, just an offering of balance. The hand released. He crossed the rest of the river with water up to his chest. On the far side, the trees opened into a narrow hollow covered in moss and ice and shadow. The father turned and walked. Owen followed, deeper, toward something he hadn't yet seen, and the trees closed behind them like a secret not yet told. The rain came hard that morning. Not a drizzle, not a passing mist. Real rain. The kind that slapped the leaves down and turned dry trails into dark ribbons of mud. It fell straight and steady, washing the world clean in streaks of gray. By the time Owen and Ruth Ann crossed the second ridge, their boots were caked with a quarter-inch of slick earth, and every branch above them sagged with weight. The forest no longer rustled. It dripped, it breathed, It narrowed around them. The father moved ahead like he belonged to the rain. His broad back, soaked and silent, cut a path through the undergrowth without once looking behind. He didn't need to. He knew the way. And Owen understood now. It wasn't just instinct. It was memory. This path had been walked before, in seasons that came long before his own. These trees had watched the same feet pass over their roots for longer than any story ever written in books. Owen shifted the weight of the child on his shoulder. The blanket was soaked through, clinging to the creature's thin frame, but it didn't shiver anymore. Its breath was shallow but calm, as if it had stopped worrying about where it was going and started trusting who was carrying it. Ruth Ann walked close behind, her coat open at the collar, her face set. She didn't complain about the pace. She didn't ask questions. But Owen saw her eyes tracking every print the father left, every curl of moss that looked touched or recently stepped through. She wasn't just following. She was learning. They passed a ring of stones half buried in wet pine needles, arranged not in a circle, but in a crescent, all tilted toward the eastern slope. Owen glanced at it, then at Ruth Ann. She nodded once. Someone had been here before them. Maybe weeks ago. Maybe this morning. Either way, the forest wasn't empty. When they reached the narrow pass between two ridgelines, the air thinned. Not from altitude, from quiet. No birds, no squirrels. Even the rain seemed to hush as they moved deeper into the fold of the mountain. Then they smelled it. Blood, sharp, metallic, sour like rust and damp like rot. Not overwhelming, not fresh, but close. The father stopped. Owen nearly stepped into him before pulling up short. The creature stirred faintly in his arms. Then the father turned his head slightly. Not fully, just enough for Owen to know it was time. They followed him down into the hollow. It was a shallow ravine, lined with rock faces slick with moss. Ferns pressed low by the storm. Water pooled in dips and cracks, reflecting slivers of movement like eyes. At the far end, beneath a jagged outcrop of stone, was a shadow that didn't move, until it did. Owen's breath caught. A figure lay half-curled on its side, chest rising slow and ragged, one arm tucked beneath its body. Fur matted and torn. Blood soaked into the ground beneath her, because it was a she. Smaller than the father, but still massive. Her ribs expanded in uneven rhythm. One leg twisted wrong. The skin beneath the fur, where it showed, was split and raw. And her face, human-like. Just like the father, just like the child. But with different eyes. Lighter, duller. The face of someone who'd held on too long and didn't know if she could anymore. The child in Owen's arms lifted its head. A sound escaped its throat. Soft, hoarse, almost a whimper. The woman's eyes opened just slightly, drawn by that sound. And then the child reached out with one small hand, weak and shaking. The mother tried to rise. She couldn't. Owen stepped forward, dropping to one knee, gently laying the child beside her. Their hands touched. Not clasped, not held. Just rested near enough for warmth to pass between. The father knelt across from them. His shoulders shook once, but he didn't make a sound. Ruth Ann moved quickly, dropping her pack, unrolling the canvas, pulling out gauze and the old medical kit she'd carried for 20 years, but hadn't touched in 5. She gave Owen one look. He nodded. They began. The wound on the woman's thigh was deep. Not from a branch, not from a fall. This was wire, rusted, barbed. Owen knew it the second he saw the tear. He'd seen it before, on deer caught in illegal snares, on dogs that wandered too far from farms. She must have been trapped. Days, maybe. Long enough to rot, but not enough to kill. Ruth Ann poured clean water, her hands moving with the speed of urgency and the care of someone who had watched too many people break. Owen pressed a hand to the creature's chest, grounding him as the child whimpered low, not in fear, but in some raw instinct to do something, anything. The mother didn't cry out. Not once. but her eyes held a scream that had never been let out. As Ruth Ann cleaned the wound, she looked up at Owen. "We need heat." He scanned the hollow, found dry bark tucked under a leaning ledge. With shaking hands, he struck the flint, blowing until the flame caught and danced weakly beneath a ring of wet stones. The fire didn't roar, but it lived. They boiled water, cut bandages, sewed slowly with trembling fingers. The mother's breathing worsened, then steadied, then faltered again. Owen gripped her wrist, searching for pulse. Ruth Ann worked the needle with her teeth clenched, her forehead damp with rain and sweat. The child pressed its forehead to her arm, eyes wide, silent. Then the father moved. He reached out, large hand hovering over Owen's. He didn't touch him, just rested his palm against the dirt beside him, eyes locked on the wound. Then, in one deliberate motion, he lowered his head and placed his other hand over the mother's. No words, no noise, just breath, shared. Owen didn't move. He let it happen. Let the forest bear witness. Let the rain fall. And when Ruth Ann tied the last knot, when she stepped back with her hands shaking and her jaw tight, the mother's chest rose. Slow, deeper than before, and stayed up. Ruth Ann dropped to her knees beside Owen, her fingers brushing the dirt. She whispered something he couldn't hear. Then she reached out and gently placed her hand over the mother's. The mother opened her eyes. Their gazes met, and in that moment, two women, one human, one not, understood each other without a single word. The child reached up and touched Ruth Ann's wrist. The rain began to soften. Owen leaned back against the stone wall, staring at the small fire flickering between them. He didn't feel the cold anymore, didn't feel the ache in his knees or the mud drying in his sleeves. He only felt the rhythm of the breath beside him, the quiet heartbeat of something sacred returning to balance. Then a shadow stepped into the edge of the firelight. Another figure. Then two. Then more. Eyes reflecting flame. Shapes standing just far enough away to not be counted. But there. Not approaching. Not intervening. Just watching. Bearing witness. Owen didn't stand. Didn't reach for his radio. He only bowed his head, hands resting on his knees. The mother slept. The father kept watch. Ruth Ann tended the child. And in the hollow, beneath the dripping stone, something older than language passed between them all. Not a bargain, not a rescue, just a shared moment in time where the forest let them in, and didn't ask them to leave. The snow hadn't settled yet, but it danced on the wind like it wanted to. Small flakes, thin and scattered, whispering down through the narrow break in the ridge like ash from a fire no one could see. The air was colder now, sharp in the lungs, dry in the back of the throat. Breath came visible with every exhale, and the rocks underfoot had begun to crisp with frost where the sun no longer reached. Everything sounded closer, footsteps, breathing, the drip of meltwater sliding off leaves, and it made the hollow feel both too big and too small all at once. Owen sat beside the fire they'd managed to keep alive through the night. Just embers now. A dull red glow curled in blackened wood, but enough to ward off the ache in his knees and the tightness in his hands. His fingers were stiff, not from the cold, from holding pressure too long, from bracing bone, from stitching through muscle. Across from him, Ruth Ann knelt beside the mother. The wound looked cleaner now. The swelling had gone down. She breathed steady, eyes closed, a shallow crease in her brow like she was still half listening to the world around her. The boy, or whatever word they could use now that names didn't quite fit, sat beside her, legs folded beneath him, head bowed. Every now and then, he'd reach out and just rest his hand near hers. Not touching, just enough to share warmth. The father stood just beyond the glow of the firelight, shoulders squared, arms crossed over his chest. A sentry made of earth and memory. He hadn't slept. He hadn't moved much, but every once in a while he would shift slightly, turning just enough to see a new edge of the tree line, or tilt his head as if some sound far off in the hills called for his judgment. And he judged quietly. The others had disappeared again into the trees, as silently as they came. No footfalls, no words. Only eyes, glinting like stars through the fog, there for a heartbeat, and gone the next. Owen knew they were still nearby. The air held it, like a pressure behind the ears. Not fear, something heavier. They hadn't been welcomed in with ceremony. No fire circle, no song, no markings on trees. But that wasn't their way. Their way was watching. Their way was waiting. And the truest kind of trust was in letting someone stay without asking them why they came. Ruth Ann stood, stretching slow, wiping her hands on her jeans. "We need more boiled water," she said, voice low. Owen nodded, stepped past her toward the far end of the hollow where the spring trickled out from a rock face. His boots crunched ice with each step. He crouched, filled the old tin kettle with water that smelled faintly of stone and pine, and turned back. He paused halfway. The father was gone, just gone. No sound, no movement, just absence. And then a shape moved in the trees. Not him, her, Nadine. She stood with one hand raised, her eyes locked on Owen's, the tranquilizer rifle slung across her shoulder. She didn't raise it. She didn't have to. Owen took 2 steps toward her. "How'd you find me?" "You didn't exactly cover your trail." She spoke quietly, like she wasn't sure who else could hear. And there were prints. So many prints. He stayed still. "You know I could end this right now," she said, her fingers tightening slightly on the stock of the rifle. "One shot. They wouldn't even know it came from me." "No," Owen said. "You won't." Her jaw clenched. "Because you saw them," he said. She didn't reply. "You saw them, Nadine. You looked in their eyes. You watched them kneel." She turned her head slowly, just enough to glance toward the trees, toward the mother, the child, the woman tending wounds with hands steadier than any soldier's. Then she looked back. "I thought we were supposed to protect the balance," she said. "We are," Owen said. "That's what I'm doing." "They're not part of it." "They are now." The snow began to fall harder, soft and slow and unhurried. Nadine lowered her hand. "I should take the shot," she whispered. "Not just because of policy, because I don't know what happens next." "None of us do." She looked at him a long moment, then unshouldered the rifle, crouched, and laid it gently at the base of a tree. Not discarded, not surrendered, just set down. 3 hours, she said. "Then I'm gone. You figure out what that means." She turned and vanished into the trees like she'd never been there at all. Owen exhaled slow. When he returned to the fire, Ruth Ann didn't ask. She just took the kettle, poured it over fresh herbs into a cracked enamel mug, and placed it beside the mother's hand. The child reached for it, lifted it with care, and helped her drink. Ruth Ann turned toward Owen. "I saw her." He nodded. She left the gun. He nodded again. The silence between them held something new. Not relief, not safety, just acknowledgement. Later that evening, as dusk fell low and long across the hollow, the mother stirred, opened her eyes fully, sat up with help, looked around at the people who had waited. Then she reached out and placed one large hand on Ruth Ann's knee. Ruth Ann stilled, then placed her own hand over it. And they stayed like that, breathing. Then the father returned. He stepped into the clearing with something wrapped in bark and leaves. He placed it beside the fire and unwrapped it carefully. Dried roots, fresh berries, long fibers twisted into cord. He handed it to Owen. Owen took it, nodded once. "Thank you." The father didn't answer, just watched. Then the child stood, walked to Owen, placed his forehead against Owen's chest, and held still. Owen didn't breathe for a full 5 seconds. He rested his hand on the boy's back. No words. Then the child stepped away, took his mother's hand. Ruth Ann stood beside them, and the forest fell into a deep hush. Snow drifted thicker now, and the fire crackled low. They didn't speak of departure, but it hung there, quiet, inevitable. Some things don't leave in the night. They just rise with the morning, and leave pieces of themselves behind in the warmth they once slept beside. By spring, the snow had melted into memory. The river ran high again, but with a different voice. No longer swollen with threat, but humming low and blue like it remembered everything and forgave most of it. Clarion County looked washed clean in the pale sun. The fields, the roads, the timbered slopes, even the sagging porch of Ruth Ann McCrae's house. All of it had the tired brightness of something that had made it through. Owen Teller stood in the side yard with a hammer in his hand and sawdust on his jeans, fixing the screen door that hadn't closed right since October. He didn't rush, not because the job was hard, but because the silence that had settled over his mornings now felt worth preserving. You didn't come back from something like that needing noise. You came back listening harder. Ruth Ann moved like she always had, only slower now, more deliberate. Her right hip still ached when the cold shifted back in after sundown, but she didn't say it out loud. Instead, she baked, cornbread mostly, or biscuits. She said it kept her hands honest. Every morning she set a plate on the porch rail, one slice missing, just to make it look like she was still figuring out the recipe. Nobody asked who the rest was for. Not anymore. Deputy Horton still swung by, same coffee thermos, same lazy smile. But the way he looked at Owen had changed. A little less law, a little more brotherhood. He didn't ask about the woods. He didn't ask about the footprints he never officially saw. Just leaned against the truck bed and talked about weather, trout, and small engines like it was all that mattered. Maybe it was. Ty drew more now, pages full. His notebooks were heavier with sketches of eyes and trees and firelight. He stopped asking questions about what was out there. Instead, he started paying attention to what was here. He'd hand Ruth Ann a drawing and say nothing. She'd nod, put it on the fridge, and that was enough. Nadine filed the last report with a blank page. Said it was an equipment malfunction. Misfiled GPS data. She transferred to Harrisburg 2 weeks later. Owen didn't ask her to stay, but she'd left a folder on his desk before she left. Empty, except for a note that read, "You saw. That's enough. Don't forget it." That morning, the fog lifted slow off the river, and Owen walked the trail behind Ruth Ann's house the way he always did now, without looking for anything, but not pretending it was empty either. The cedar trees were beginning to bud. Birds had returned. And on the third fence post past the woodpile, he found something. 5 streaks of mud, not clawed, not smeared, just pressed gently, like fingers leaning on the rail for balance. They were fresh. He didn't say anything to Ruth Ann, just stepped back into the kitchen, set his gloves by the stove, and poured a mug of coffee. She slid a plate toward him. 2 biscuits, 1 already bitten. "I think we've got a raccoon again," she said, without looking up. He smiled and said nothing. Later that afternoon, he drove to the cemetery on the hill. Parked beneath the sycamore tree that hadn't grown right since the lightning strike. Carried no flowers, just a thermos and a folded napkin. He stood by his father's grave, hands in his coat pockets, and looked down at the name carved in old stone. "I brought you something," he said. "Didn't bake it, but Ruth Ann's got that part covered." He sat on the ground, unwrapped the biscuit, placed it on the dirt. "I kept the promise," he said. "I didn't leave anyone behind." The wind moved slow through the branches above him, soft and low, like something listening but not wanting to interrupt. He closed his eyes, listened to it all. The breeze, the river in the distance, the sound of a mourning dove far off near the water. And one more thing, faint, almost like a breath behind him. He turned, no one there, but the air held weight, like gratitude. That night, just after the rain started, light, more of a mist than a storm, he walked the front porch once more before bed. Habit now. The yard was quiet. The hills were darker than usual, moon behind clouds. He started to turn back in, then paused. There on the wooden step sat 2 things. A small, wet stone, round, river smooth, dark with moss and streaked with white. Beside it, a loop of rope, old, worn, frayed just slightly at the ends, things that should have been lost long ago. He crouched, picked them up, turned them in his hands. Familiar, not from the world he walked every day, from the one he'd stumbled into by accident, or maybe had been chosen to step into, long before he ever heard the scream on that riverbank. No note, no symbols, just objects returned, like the end of a sentence no one else could write. He placed them on the windowsill inside the kitchen, not to hide them, just to keep them close. The next morning, 5 new prints appeared in the garden, not deep, not obvious, but aligned. Like someone had stood there listening to the house breathe. He didn't go out to greet them. He didn't need to. Instead, he made coffee, walked out onto the porch, and sat in the rocking chair that had started creaking again when the frost melted. And across the river, beyond the line of pine and fog, he saw them. Just silhouettes, no movement. The father, the mother, the child, together. Watching, not waiting, not asking, just there. He didn't wave. He didn't have to. He brought his hand to his chest, touched the faint bruise just below the collarbone, the place where that heavy forehead had once pressed in thanks. The shape still there. Barely, but warm. Then he looked to the water, listened. The river didn't roar now. It whispered, low, patient, the way it had the day the child first washed up into his arms. He closed his eyes and whispered back, "We're even." The wind lifted, just enough to carry that sentence. And maybe, just maybe, return something else with it.